Alexander the Great conquered more than just cities. He conquered kings, armies, nations, and the imagination of the ancient world. All of this before he was 33. Before he was 33, he had shattered mighty Persia. He had marched through Egypt, crossed into Asia, and carved his name so deeply into history that men still speak of his name 2,000 years later. But conquest did something terrible to Alexander's soul. Victory whispered to him. It told him he was chosen. Then it told him he was above other men. Then, at last, it whispered the oldest lie ever spoken to mankind. Ye shall be as gods. This is not just a story about Alexander. It is a story about pride, glory, ambition, the hunger in man to rise above his station and crown himself with stolen divinity. But Christianity gives us the great reversal. Alexander was a man who reached upward, trying to become divine. Christ is God who stepped downward, choosing to become man. Alexander demanded glory. Christ embraced humility. Alexander shed the blood of others to build his kingdom. Christ shed his own blood to save the world. And that is the question at the heart of this video. What happens when the greatest conqueror in history stands before the crucified king? Alexander was not an ordinary conqueror. He was not merely a young king with sword in hand, nor merely a brilliant general who happened to inherit a throne at just the right time in history. He was something rarer, and therefore something more dangerous. He was a man whose victories became so enormous, so swift, and so unnatural in the eyes of the world, that he began to look upon his own life as it were not merely guided by destiny, but raised above the common limits of man. At just 20 years old, Alexander inherited the kingdom of Macedon. Most men at 20 are still being shaped. Most men are still learning discipline, restraint, judgment, and the proper measure of themselves. But Alexander was given armies. He was given a throne. He was given the legacy of Philip, the fire of Homer, the training of Aristotle, and the dream of conquering mighty Persia. And he did not waste it. He crossed into Asia. He shattered the Persian armies. He took cities that thought themselves secured. He marched through heat, dust, hunger, mutiny, and blood. He stood at the front when other kings would have remained behind. He bled with his men. He risked himself in battle. And because of this, his soldiers did not merely fear him. They loved him. They followed him into lands they did not know, against armies that they did not fully understand, beneath skies that seemed farther and stranger the deeper they marched into the east. There is a certain greatness in that. A Christian should not be afraid to admit greatness when he sees it. Alexander did have courage. He had discipline, and he had vision. Alexander had that rare and terrible force of soul that bends events around itself and makes other men feel that history has suddenly taken human form. But greatness is not holiness. That is the point many people miss. The ancient world often confused power with divine favor. If a man conquered, perhaps the gods loved him. If a man triumphed, perhaps heaven had chosen him. If a man stood over kings and nations, perhaps he was not merely a man at all. And this is where Alexander's story begins to darken. Because victory does not only crown a man, victory tests a man. Failures humble many men. Suffering humbles many men. But defeat can crush your pride because it forces a man to see the limits of his own strength. But victory is more subtle. Victory comes dressed as proof. It says, "You were right. You are chosen. The rules that bind other men, they don't apply to you. Look at what you have done. Surely you are more than they are." And that whisper is old. Older than Macedon, Persia, Egypt, older than every empire that ever rose and fell beneath the sun. It is the whisper from Eden. Ye shall be as gods. That is the first temptation. Not merely to disobey, not merely to take the forbidden fruit, but to reject the creaturely place God gave us, and to seize by pride what can only be received by grace. Alexander reached the Oracle of Siwa in Egypt, and there his identity began to take on a more divine shape in the imagination of the world. Whether he believed every word of it in the same way a worshipper believes doctrine, or whether he used it as kings often used religion for politics, unity, and authority, the effect was the same. The line between king and God began to blur, and when the line blurs, the soul is in danger. Because a man can wear a crown and remain a man can command armies and remain a man. He can win glory and remain a man. But when a man begins to crave worship, something inside of him has begun to rot. Alexander wanted the world. Then the world was not enough. He wanted obedience. Then obedience was not enough. He wanted loyalty. But loyalty was not enough. He wanted reverence, submission. He wanted his name lifted upon morality. This is the tragedy of the upward-reaching man. You see, the upward-reaching man, he climbs and he climbs, believing that heaven is somewhere above the next victory, the next city, the next crown, the next bowed head. But heaven cannot be conquered. God, Elohim, cannot be seized. Divinity cannot be stolen by ambition. The man who tries to become a god does not become divine. He becomes less human. And Alexander, for all his brilliance, had begun to walk that road. There is a terrible irony at the center of Alexander's mighty life. He conquered nations, but he could not conquer himself. He broke the armies of Persia, but he could not break the fever of his own ambition. He crossed deserts, mountains, rivers, and strange frontiers, but he could not cross the inner abyss that divides greatness from holiness. And that is why his story still matters. Not because he won battles. Many men throughout history have won battles. Not because he killed kings. There have been many kingslayers. Not because he changed maps. Maps have changed since the beginning of time. Alexander matters because he shows us what happens when a man possesses almost everything except peace. He had youth, genius, beauty. He had the love of his soldiers, and he had cities that bore his name. He had poets, priests, courtiers, generals, and conquered peoples, all helping to build the image of a man larger than life. But the soul cannot live on image. The soul cannot be fed by applause. It cannot be healed by conquest. This is where the old pagan idea of glory begins to crack. Because glory can lift a man before the eyes of another, but it cannot purify him before the eyes of God. Glory can make men remember your name, but it cannot make your heart clean. Glory can fill the world with your statues, but it cannot silence the judgment of conscience. And Alexander's conscience was not absent. That is important. He was not a simple monster. He was not a flat tyrant with no human depth. He loved. He grieved. He honored courage. He rewarded loyalty. He could be generous, but he could also be very violent, suspicious, proud, drunk with anger, and terrible when he was crossed. That is what makes him human. That is what makes him frightening, because the battle inside Alexander is the battle inside of all men. His is only magnified by empire. Most of us will never command armies. Most of us will never see kings bow, will never have cities named after us, but every man has a little empire inside of his chest. Every man has a throne he wants to sit on, a room where he wants applause. Every man has a wound he wants the glory to heal. Every man has a secret desire to be seen, praised, obeyed, remembered, and justified. That is why Alexander is not so far distant from us. He is close. He is the human heart with the volume turned up until the whole world can hear it. When Alexander demanded proskynesis, the ritual act of bowing before him, the tension became visible. To Persians, such gestures belonged to the courts. To Greeks and Macedonians, bowing like that before a man carried a different smell. It smelled of servility. It smelled of godlike kingship. It smelled like a free man being asked to reduce himself before another mortal. And his men felt this. These were Macedonians. They had fought with him, bled with him, had watched friends die in lands far from home. They had followed him further than many men have ever wanted to go. They could honor him as king. They could follow him as a commander. They could admire him as one of the greatest warriors to have ever lived. But worship, or anything that resembled worship, was an entirely another matter. A leader may ask men for courage. He may ask them for discipline. He may ask them for sacrifice. But when he begins to ask them for reverence that belongs only to the heavens, he has crossed from kingship into idolatry. And this is the old sickness of power. Power rarely begins by saying, "Become wicked." That would be too obvious. Power begins by saying, "You are necessary." Then it says, "You are exceptional. You are misunderstood. You are above the small laws that bind small men." Then finally, when the soul has become used to the poison, it says, "You are like God." This is not only politics. This is spiritual warfare. This is the structure of pride. Pride does not always appear as arrogance at first. Sometimes pride appears as destiny, responsibility. Sometimes pride appears as wounded greatness demanding recognition. A man may even convince himself that his pride serves a noble purpose. He may tell himself that the empire needs it, the people need it, the mission needs it, the future needs it. But God is not mocked. A proud soul, even when dressed in greatness, remains proud. A throne can hide many things from men, but it cannot hide anything from God. Alexander reached the edge of the known world, and still he was restless. He gained more than almost any man could ever dream, but still he wanted more. His empire grew outward while his soul remained unsatisfied inward. That is the tragedy. Not that Alexander failed to become great. He became great. Not that history forgot him. History will always remember him. Not that his name has vanished. His name still commands attention after more than 2,000 years. But the tragedy is deeper. Alexander became great in the eyes of men, but greatness could not save him. He became almost superhuman in legend, but legend could not make him holy. He conquered the world, but he could not conquer the old Adam within himself. And then Christianity enters history like thunder wrapped in silence. Because the gospel does not give us another conqueror reaching upward. It gives us God himself stepping downward. Here is the great reversal. Alexander was a man who reached upward, trying to touch divinity. Christ is God who stepped downward, taking on the form of humanity. Alexander grasped for heaven. Christ descended from heaven. Alexander wanted men to bow. Christ knelt and washed the feet of his disciples. Alexander shed the blood of others to build his kingdom. Christ shed his own blood to save his enemies. That contrast is not small. It is the difference between pagan glory and Christian glory. It is the difference between the old man and the new Adam. It's the difference between the throne built by pride and the kingdom revealed through the cross. The world looks at Alexander and sees greatness, and in a human sense, there is greatness there. But the Christian looks deeper. The Christian asks a harder question. What is greatness worth if it cannot make a man humble? What is conquest worth if the conqueror remains enslaved to himself? What is fame worth if the soul remains hungry? What is power worth if death still takes the king like every beggar, slave, soldier, and child beneath his rule? Alexander died young. His mighty kingdom fractured. His generals divided the inheritance. The cities remained, the legend grew, the name endured, but Alexander himself went the way of all flesh. That is the great humiliation history gives to every proud man. No matter how high he climbs, the grave waits at the bottom. The grave does not care about titles, does not care about banners. It does not bow before kings. The grave reaches emperors and peasants with the same cold silence. And this is why Christ is not merely another figure in history. Christ does not enter the world as one more ambitious man seeking a crown. He is not Alexander. He is not Caesar. He is not another warrior trying to carve immortality in the stone. He is the eternal Son of God, born in humility, placed in a manger, hidden in poverty, obedient to the Father, and walking towards a cross the world mistook for defeat. Alexander rode with his armies. Christ walked with fishermen. Alexander took cities. Christ healed the sick. Alexander made men afraid. Christ told men, "Fear not." Alexander was crowned with honor. Christ was crowned with thorns. Alexander's hands were marked by conquest. Christ's hands were pierced for the life of the world. This is the scandal of Christianity. God does not save the world by imitating the pride of kings. He saves the world by overturning it. He does not reveal power as domination. He reveals power as love. He does not reveal glory as self-exaltation. He reveals glory as self-giving. He does not demand that man climb into heaven by ambition. He opens heaven by descending into our suffering, our flesh, our death, and our darkness. Alexander wanted to become divine. Christ, being divine, became man. There is the whole mystery. There is the entire sermon. There is the blade that cuts through every false idea of greatness. Because the Christian knife is not the imitation of Alexander. It is the imitation of Christ. Not grasping, not boasting, not demanding worship, not building a kingdom of ego, not mistaking applause for salvation. The Christian path is humility. It is repentance. It is the cross. And the cross is unbearable to the proud man because it tells him the truth he spends his life fleeing. That you are not God. We are dust. We are mortal. We are wounded. We are accountable. And yes, we need mercy. But the cross does not humiliate man in order to destroy him. It humbles man in order to heal him. That is the mercy of God. The world says, make yourself great. Christ says, lose your life and you will find it. The world says, rise above others. But Christ says, the greatest among you will become your servant. The world says, build your name. Christ says, take up your cross and follow me. And so Alexander stands before us as a warning, a magnificent warning, a brilliant warning, but a tragic warning. He shows us what man becomes when greatness is severed from humility. He shows us how high ambition can rise and how empty it can remain. He shows us that even the greatest conquerors cannot defeat sin, death, or the hunger of his own soul. But Christ shows us this answer. Not another empire, not another campaign, not another monument, and not another king demanding that men kneel beneath him. Christ shows us God on the cross, God in humility, God in suffering, God entering death to break it from within. Alexander reached upward and died. Christ descended into death and rose. That is the difference. That is the gospel. That is why the proud man's glory fades, but the crucified Lord reigns forever. So remember this. The world will always offer you Alexander. Strength without surrender. Glory without repentance. Victory without humility. A crown without a cross. But Christ offers something greater. Not the illusion of becoming God, but the mercy of becoming truly human again. A man restored, a soul healed, a sinner forgiven, a creature returned to his almighty creator. Alexander wanted to become God. Christ became man, and only one of them conquered death.